The Dagger and the Door. A post-imperial essay on Henry Nowak, Belfast, Jewish memory, migrant fear, and the tragedy of a country too weak to protect anyone. By Elias Winter. June 10, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. The Boy and the Dagger. Henry Nowak was 18 years old. That is the first fact, before the politics, before the footage, before the slogans, before the men with flags discovered his name and turned it into one more object in the national bonfire. He was 18, a boy at the beginning of that brief and foolish age when life still appears to be expanding, when a city is not yet a battlefield, but a map of possible nights, possible friends, possible mistakes, possible futures. Southampton was not a sacred place. It was not a battlefield of civilizations. It was a university town, a port city, one more British place where the young walk home under weak streetlights with their coats open and their guard down. Then came the dagger. Not a metaphorical dagger, not a hidden dagger in the language of politics. A literal blade carried in modern Britain by a man who lived under the protection of a religious exception the state had decided it was too refined, too plural, too careful, too historically sensitive to question. In a country where boys are lectured about knives, where schools perform safeguarding rituals, where airports confiscate nail scissors, where police forces issue solemn public safety campaigns about the horror of blades, a man was permitted to move through the public world with a ceremonial weapon. This is the absurdity before the tragedy. Or rather, it is part of the tragedy. The liberal state, in its late imperial confusion, had built a cathedral of exceptions. Everyone else was told that the blade was the symbol of disorder, masculinity, delinquency, street violence, social collapse. But here the blade passed through another doorway. Here the blade acquired vocabulary. It became heritage, identity, accommodation, respect. It became the sort of object that no official wanted to describe plainly, because plain description would reveal the stupidity of the arrangement. A dagger is a dagger. The fact that it has been given a sacred biography does not make it less able to enter a body. This does not indict a people. It indicts an exemption. A civilization has the right to honor another man's faith without granting his knife a passport. Vikram Digwa did not merely carry a religious object. He turned it into the oldest thing a blade can become. He used it on a boy. There is a particular grotesqueness in that transformation. The sacred object, the marker of discipline and devotion, becomes an instrument of cowardice. The symbolic weapon becomes the actual wound. The man who carries the blade under the language of honor enters the record not as a guardian of conscience, but as one more small man with a story to tell after another person is bleeding. And he did have a story. That is what killers often reach for when the blood appears. Not silence, not confession, story. He claimed, according to the reporting, that he had been attacked, racially abused, forced to defend himself. In other words, the blade did not only enter Henry Nowak's body. A narrative followed it. The narrative arrived quickly, maybe more quickly than reality itself could be seen. The victim became suspect. The dying boy became a problem to be controlled. The man with the dagger became the man with a grievance. This is what happens in exhausted societies. Facts arrive limping, but scripts arrive armed. The police came into the scene with the dull urgency of men trained to administer danger rather than perceive truth. They saw what they had been taught to see. Or, perhaps, they saw nothing at all. Henry Nowak, stabbed and dying, was handcuffed. He said he could not breathe. He said he had been stabbed. There is no literary invention capable of improving that horror. The sentence is sufficient. A boy told the state the truth, and the state restrained him. This is not a left-wing scandal or a right-wing scandal. It is not a story about one tribe's hypocrisy redeeming the other tribe's madness. The same police culture that can march elderly pro-Palestine protesters into vans for holding signs, the same procedural machine that can confuse dissent with danger, can also look at a dying boy on the pavement and treat him as the disorder to be managed. This is the point the factions cannot bear. The far right sees Henry Nowak and says the police have been captured by liberal guilt. The liberal establishment sees the far right using Henry Nowak and says the police must be defended against racist agitation. Both are half-blind. The police are not innocent because the far right hates them. The police are not fascist only when they arrest old women protesting for Palestine. The police are not suddenly sacred when they fail a white boy. The problem is deeper. A state that has lost moral sight and compensates with procedure. A state that no longer knows how to look directly at reality without first consulting the approved script. A state that can be brutal toward the harmless and stupid before the bleeding. A state that confuses order with justice because order is easier to document. Henry Nowak's death became a symbol because everything around it was already symbolic. The dagger was symbolic. The exception was symbolic. The accusation of racism was symbolic. The police body camera was symbolic. The handcuffs were symbolic. The street after his death became symbolic. The men who later shouted his name made him symbolic. The tragedy is that before he was a symbol, he was a boy. A boy on a pavement. A boy whose life had not yet hardened into biography. A boy whose parents did not need a theory of empire or migration, or policing, or religious accommodation. They needed him alive. The absurdity of the dagger should not be softened. It belongs in the center of the story. It is absurd that a modern state terrified of knives could not bring itself to say that religious meaning does not entitle anyone to carry a functional blade in public. It is absurd that a civilization so bureaucratically alive to every category of harm could fail at the simplest one. It is absurd that the sacred vocabulary of pluralism could end with a dead student and a dying boy in handcuffs. But absurdity is not comedy here. It is the sound tragedy makes when the institutions become too stupid to recognize themselves. Henry Nowak did not die in the wilderness. He died inside the paperwork of a civilization that had forgotten how to look at a bleeding boy and know who needed saving. 2. The woman behind the door. Then came the mob. Not justice, not grief, not public anger purified by moral clarity. The mob. There is always a point in these stories when the dead are betrayed by the living who claim to avenge them. The victim's name becomes a torch. The wound becomes permission. The specific crime becomes general accusation. A man does something terrible, and then the crowd decides that an entire category of people must answer for him. That is the hour when protest becomes pogrom. In Belfast, and in the surrounding eruptions of anti-migrant violence in Northern Ireland, the scene changed from the pavement to the house. The first story had a boy outside, exposed to the state. The second has a woman inside, exposed to the crowd. This is the necessary reversal. Because if Henry Nowak reveals the cruelty of a state that cannot see the victim, the woman behind the door reveals the cruelty of men who no longer care who the victim is. Imagine her not as a demographic, but as a body in a room. She has furniture. She has a phone. She has a door whose meaning has suddenly changed. A door is supposed to separate the private from the public, the home from the street, the sleeping from the shouting. It is one of civilization's smallest promises. On one side, the person. On the other, the world. A society can be measured by whether that door still means anything when men gather outside. For the women trapped in Belfast, the door became a question. Outside were masked men, young men, local men, men drunk on the heat of belonging to a crowd. Cars burned, windows broke. Flames spoke the language that cowards prefer, because fire does not need to argue. It only declares. A migrant home is marked. A family is marked. A woman is marked. Not for what she did, but for what she represents to men who have run out of explanations for their own country. One of the most chilling details from the reporting was that women trapped in their own home were advised to put on their care worker uniforms, as if the uniform might persuade the mob that they were useful enough to spare. Pause there. That is a whole civilization in miniature. A woman in danger from men outside her house is told to dress herself as labor, not as a citizen, not as a neighbor, not as a human being, but as a function. Put on the uniform. Show them you care for their old. Show them your usefulness. Show them that your body has been converted into service. Perhaps then they will not break the door. Perhaps then the category will soften. Perhaps then the men outside will decide that this particular foreign woman has earned the temporary right not to be burned. There is no clearer image of the moral humiliation of the migrant poor in a declining country. They are wanted as hands and hated as presence. Wanted at the bedside, hated in the street. Wanted in the care home, hated in the housing queue. Wanted in the economy, hated in the myth. They are asked to clean the empire's last rooms while being told they have dirtied the house. The men outside her door were not defending Henry Nowak. They were desecrating him. That must be said plainly. The dead boy did not need arson committed in his name. The wounded man in Belfast did not need strangers to become targets. The victim of a knife attack is not honored by men who then terrorize people who did not hold the knife. This is not justice. It is the transfer of guilt from the guilty to the visible. That transfer is the essence of the pogrom. The pogrom does not require careful evidence. It does not require courts. It does not require the person behind the door to know the suspect or share his crime or even share his country. It needs only the broad outline of otherness: African, migrant, asylum seeker, foreigner, Muslim, Roma, Sikh, stranger. The category expands as the mob grows. Precision is the enemy of vengeance, so vengeance abolishes precision. The men who commit these acts often imagine themselves as abandoned citizens. Sometimes they are abandoned. That is what makes the tragedy more dangerous. The lie of the mob is not that the society is healthy. The society is not healthy. The state has failed. Housing is broken. Wages are weak. Borders are chaotic. Police are untrusted. Public services are collapsing into queues and apology notices. The native poor look around and see a country that has asked them to absorb decline, while elites speak the language of compassion from safer rooms. But grievance does not become innocence because it has evidence. A man may be right that his country has failed him and still be guilty when he raises his hand against a woman behind a door. A crowd may correctly sense that the state is lying and still become a beast when it burns the house of someone who did not make the lie. That is the part both camps avoid. The liberal establishment wants to pretend the mob emerges from pure hatred, as if no real disorder preceded it. The nationalist right wants to pretend the mob is the voice of the people, as if burning families out of homes is a form of democratic speech. Both refuse tragedy, because tragedy requires seeing more than one truth at once. The woman behind the door sees all of it, without needing theory. She knows the state is weak because she is waiting for it. She knows the mob is evil because it is outside. She knows her innocence does not protect her because the men have not come for guilt. They have come for meaning. They have come to turn her body into an answer. A pogrom is not only the moment the door breaks. It is the hour before, when the person inside realizes the law may not arrive, and the men outside have stopped needing a name. 3. Alexandria, the first grammar of the mob. There was a city before Belfast. There was a city before Southampton, before Britain, before the police camera, before the asylum hotel, before the news clip and the viral rumor. There was Alexandria, brilliant, crowded, imperial, multilingual, suspicious of itself. A city where peoples lived beside each other without becoming one another. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Romans, a port city of commerce and resentment, learning and hierarchy, sacred pride and civic insult. Alexandria is useful because it refuses the fantasy that modernity invented this problem. It did not. Modernity gave the mob faster signals, better cameras, and more efficient rumor. It did not create the desire to blame a minority for the failure of a city to reconcile itself. The Jews of Alexandria were not migrants in the modern sense. They were not asylum seekers waiting for a caseworker. They were not small boat arrivals or visa overstayers or foreign students converted into political symbols by newspaper columns. They were an ancient community, rooted and distinct, with memory, law, text, worship, and a connection to a homeland that was historical, theological, and civilizational. They had lived in the Greek-speaking world long enough to become part of its fabric, and yet remained available to be described as alien when the city required an enemy. This is one of the terrible gifts of Jewish history. It shows that long residence does not save a people once a society decides to narrate them as foreign. In Alexandria, the machinery was already recognizable. A city under imperial pressure, status anxiety, competing claims to civic belonging, a minority whose difference had become politically useful, authorities who could restrain violence or permit it, punish it or ride it, clarify reality or let rumor do its work. The mob moves through such ambiguity like fire through dry wood. The Alexandrian violence against Jews in 38 CE is often remembered as one of the earliest pogrom-like episodes in Jewish history. Whether one uses the word with strict modern caution or ancient moral recognition, the structure is familiar. Jewish homes and bodies became available to the crowd. A community was not addressed as a set of persons, but as a collective accusation. Difference was reclassified as provocation. Presence became offense. The mob does not begin by saying, "Let us be evil." It begins by saying, "They have gone too far. They have too much privilege. They do not belong. They insult us. They are protected by power. They are loyal elsewhere. They are not like us. Their customs are arrogant. Their separateness is a threat. Their success is theft. Their poverty is filth. Their weakness is a burden. Their strength is conspiracy. The content changes by century. The grammar does not. That grammar is what matters. The pogrom is not random violence. It is violence with a story. It gives the crowd the intoxicating feeling that destruction has become explanation. The broken shop window is not vandalism, it is purification. The burned house is not arson, it is correction. The terrified family is not a family, it is the visible surface of an invisible plot. The mob does not merely attack people, it attacks the meaning it has assigned to them. That is why the analogy between Alexandria and Belfast must be handled carefully, but not abandoned. The Jews of ancient Alexandria are not the same as modern migrants in Northern Ireland. Their history is older, their relationship to exile more sacred, their communal continuity more profound, and the later history of anti-Semitism more uniquely conspiratorial. The Jew in European imagination would become not merely foreign, but impossibly powerful. Financier, revolutionary, cosmopolitan, poisoner, rootless intellectual, hidden ruler. Anti-migrant hatred often works differently. It more often casts the stranger as poor, criminal, burdensome, fecund, incompatible, invasive. These are not identical mythologies. But the mob does not need identical mythology. It needs usable difference. In Alexandria, the Jew could be made into the problem the city could not solve. In Belfast, the migrant could be made into the problem the country could not solve. In both cases, the crowd moves from grievance to category, from category to permission, from permission to terror. The person disappears. The explanation remains. The ancient world did not have social media, but it had rumor. It did not have algorithmic outrage, but it had civic humiliation. It did not have television footage, but it had public spectacle. It did not have the modern asylum system, but it had empire, the higher power under which local resentments fermented. The people in the street may hate one another, but above them there is always a larger authority, arranging the conditions of their hatred and denying responsibility for the result. This is why empires are so often present in these stories. They gather peoples, rearrange status, protect some groups at some moments, abandon them at others, and then act surprised when the city below them burns. Alexandria teaches the oldest lesson of the street. When a city cannot bear its own contradictions, it looks for a minority to carry them out the gate. 4. The diaspora and the stranger. The Jews are one of the oldest diasporic peoples in human history. That sentence is true, but it is not enough. It must be handled like a blade of its own, because analogy can illuminate and it can desecrate. Jews are not merely an early version of modern migrants. They are an ancient people, an ethno-religious civilization, a textual nation, a covenantal memory moving through empires, languages, expulsions, accommodations, massacres, golden ages, ghettos, emancipations, betrayals, and returns. Their diaspora is not just movement. It is metaphysics under historical pressure. And yet, the Jewish story remains indispensable because it reveals what frightened societies do to those they call strangers. Migration is not an exception in human history. It is one of the basic movements of the species. Peoples move because armies come, rivers fail, markets open, empires recruit, factories need hands, crops die, borders shift, sons are drafted, daughters are threatened, gods are persecuted, wages disappear, and the rumor of safety crosses mountains faster than law. The settled imagine themselves as morally superior because they happen, for a few generations, not to be moving. But every settled people is descended from movement, conquest, flight, mixture, arrival, or permission. The question is not whether migration is natural. It is. The question is whether every society, in every stage of strength or decline, can absorb every movement without breaking something human. That is the question the liberal mind avoids, because it has mistaken compassion for administrative capacity. And it is the question the nationalist mind corrupts, because it has mistaken limitation for hatred. Diasporas can enrich the societies that receive them. They bring language, labor, memory, food, trade, discipline, ambition, grief, and the strange creative energy of people forced to live between worlds. Jews did this across centuries. Armenians did this. Indians, Syrians, Lebanese, Iranians, Somalis, Nigerians, Ukrainians, Poles, Pakistanis, Afghans, Sudanese, Kurds, each in different ways, with different burdens and gifts. There is no civilization that has not been altered by the stranger. But diaspora also creates tension, especially when the host society is weak. Difference that might have been tolerated in abundance becomes resented in scarcity. Communal networks that might have seemed charming in stability begin to look like separation in decline. Religious practice becomes political symbol. Clothing becomes accusation. Language becomes evidence. Marriage patterns become commentary. Neighborhoods become maps of anxiety. The stranger does not even have to do anything wrong. His continuity is enough to irritate a society losing its own. Assimilation is the word everyone uses and almost no one defines honestly. To the sentimental liberal, assimilation often sounds like oppression, as if asking newcomers to adapt to a receiving society is a form of violence. To the reactionary, assimilation often means disappearance. Eat like us, speak like us, marry like us, remember nothing before us, become grateful and invisible. Both are false. Healthy assimilation is neither erasure nor defiance. It is the slow acquisition of shared civic reflexes. It means the newcomer can keep memory without building a rival sovereignty. It means the host can welcome difference without surrendering the right to maintain a common world. It means the child can inherit the grandmother's language and still belong to the schoolyard. It means the sacred object does not override public safety. It means the host society does not make every foreign custom into a threat, and the migrant community does not make every boundary into persecution. But this requires strength. It requires housing. It requires schools that can teach, police that can be trusted, courts that can decide quickly, borders that mean something, public services that do not turn neighbors into competitors for delay, political leaders who can tell the truth without feeding hatred, a national story large enough to include the newcomer, but coherent enough not to dissolve into apology. Declining states cannot do this well. They do something worse. They import labor without belonging. They preach diversity without solidarity. They underbuild houses and then blame the poor for noticing crowding. They welcome workers into care homes and warehouses while letting newspapers turn them into invaders. They allow enclaves to form, then act shocked when mistrust follows. They tolerate religious exemptions they would never defend in universal terms, then call people bigots for noticing the inequality. They use migrants to patch the demographic and labor failures of the nation while pretending this is pure virtue. And then, one day, a crime happens. A stabbing, an assault, a rape allegation, a rumor, a video, a name, a nationality, a religion. Suddenly, every unresolved contradiction has a face. This is where Jewish history becomes warning, not equation. Jews were often blamed not because they had just arrived, but because they had remained. They were useful and resented, familiar and foreign, local and elsewhere, protected and vulnerable. Their difference became the container for the host society's fear. When economies trembled, when plagues spread, when empires weakened, when nationalism required purification, the Jew became explanation. Modern migrants are not the new Jews in any simple sense. That phrase is too easy and too disrespectful to both histories. But the mechanism by which a society chooses a visible minority to carry its shame is old. The Jew teaches the structure. The migrant reveals its new costume. The Jewish story does not tell us that every migrant is a Jew. It tells us what frightened civilizations do when they decide a neighbor has become an explanation. 5. The island after empire. Britain still speaks in the accent of empire. This is part of its sickness. It has the memory of command without the material basis for command. It has the moral vocabulary of a country that once governed oceans and the fiscal posture of a country struggling to govern waiting lists. It has museums full of extraction, institutions full of imperial afterglow, newspapers full of theatrical sovereignty, and towns where the actual public realm has become tired, rented, underpaid, surveilled, and cold. The British state still wants to imagine itself as a sanctuary because empire once imagined itself as civilization. But sanctuary is not a self-description. It is a capacity. Can you house the person you admit? Can you process his claim before his life dissolves into limbo? Can you protect him from the mob? Can you protect the citizen from the criminal? Can you deport the person with no right to remain? Can you distinguish refugee from opportunist, dissident from fraud, student from future overstayer, labor need from wage suppression, mercy from demographic panic? Can you tell the truth to your own people without handing them a torch? If not, then you are not administering compassion. You are staging a morality play on top of a failing machine. Britain's decline is not a collapse into poverty. That is too crude. Britain remains rich by global standards. Its decline is more humiliating because it is administrative, productive, civic, and psychological. It is the decline of a state that spends enormous sums and still cannot produce confidence. The decline of a country whose productivity growth has slowed to a crawl. The decline of a public sector that consumes a vast share of national income, while ordinary people experience scarcity in housing, healthcare, policing, transport, and time. The decline of an island increasingly dependent on imported energy. The decline of a nation whose young cannot easily form households, whose old wait for care, whose workers feel taxed and under-rewarded, whose politics converts every material failure into cultural accusation. A growing empire can absorb contradictions because it has surplus. It can open ports, recruit labor, grant exceptions, tolerate enclaves, improvise administration, and cover mistakes with expansion. A declining state cannot do this. It has no frontier into which disorder can be pushed. It has no imperial dividend large enough to disguise domestic strain. It has no moral right to confuse its former grandeur with present capacity. This is why the asylum and migration question has become so combustible. The official humanitarian language still assumes a competent receiving state. It imagines a person fleeing persecution, arriving at the border, being processed by law, housed decently, protected from violence, integrated into society if accepted, removed if refused, and treated throughout with order and dignity. This is the theory. The reality is something else. Claims pile up. Hotels become symbols. Boats become rituals of humiliation. Smugglers profit. Citizens see arrivals, but not removals. Migrants wait in limbo. Local services strain. Genuine refugees are mixed in public imagination with illegal entrants, economic migrants, criminals, students, workers, and second-generation citizens. The categories collapse. Once categories collapse, trust collapses. Once trust collapses, the demagogue does not need to invent much. He only has to point at the confusion and give it a race. That does not make the demagogue right. It makes the state guilty for feeding him. The humane position is not endless openness. That is sentimental vanity when capacity is gone. The humane position is also not ethnic closure. That is fear pretending to be wisdom. The humane position is tragic governance. Fewer admissions, faster decisions, real removals, stronger protection for those accepted, honest burden sharing, strict public safety law with no sacred weapons loopholes, serious integration, and a refusal to place vulnerable people into communities where the state already knows it cannot protect them. Humanitarian obligation must be indexed to state capacity. Mercy without capacity becomes cruelty. Openness without order produces the mob. Restriction without humanity produces the camp. A country experiencing pogrom-like eruptions against migrants should not boast of asylum. It should tremble. It should send a warning not because the stranger deserves abandonment, but because the promise of safety has become uncertain. Do not romanticize Britain. Do not imagine the old imperial center as a guaranteed shelter. The island is anxious. Its institutions are strained. Its streets are politically available. Its police are confused. Its poor are angry. Its elites are evasive. Its mobs are learning old rituals with new phones. Yet even here, one must be careful. Not every danger at home is less than the danger of Belfast. Some people flee torture. Some flee prison. Some flee ethnic cleansing, religious persecution, forced conscription, rape, famine, cartel rule, state collapse, execution. To tell them that Britain is always worse would be false, but to tell them Britain is simply safe would also be false. The truth is harder. The sanctuary is damaged. The receiving country may not be able to receive you without making you a symbol. The law may admit you, but the street may not. The economy may use you, but the culture may resent you. The state may call you protected, but the door may still shake at night. A tired island must ask whether it can keep the people it invites from being burned out of their homes. 6. No innocent nation. There is no clean tribe in this story. That is why it is unbearable. Henry Nowak is innocent. He should be alive. No theory of pluralism, no religious accommodation, no police procedure, no racial narrative, no political caution, no bureaucratic reflex can be allowed to obscure the simplicity of that fact. A boy was stabbed. A boy died. A boy who told the truth was treated in his final moments as if the truth needed to wait for permission. The woman behind the Belfast door is innocent. She did not stab anyone. She did not design the asylum system. She did not underbuild housing. She did not write the laws. She did not close the factories, weaken the wages, mismanage the borders, or teach British elites to confuse moral vocabulary with operational competence. She was in her house. That should have been enough. The police are guilty in one way and trapped in another. They enforce the scripts of a state that no longer sees clearly. They arrest the wrong harmless people and fail the right endangered ones. They become the public face of contradictions they did not invent, but often administer with stupidity and force. They are not the root of everything, but they are often where the root touches the skin. The mobs are guilty. Their grievance may have sources. Their violence has no excuse. A man who burns the house of a stranger because another stranger committed a crime has crossed the border between politics and evil. He may speak of his country, his daughters, his streets, his fear, his abandonment. Some of it may be real. But when he stands outside the door of an innocent woman, he is no longer merely abandoned. He is an agent of abandonment. The migrants are vulnerable, but vulnerability does not abolish all questions about migration. Some are refugees, some are workers, some are opportunists, some assimilate with discipline and gratitude. Some do not. Some bring gifts, some bring wounds, some bring habits that will clash with the host society. Some are criminals, as every human population contains criminals. To say this is not hatred, it is adulthood. A humane society must be able to distinguish without dehumanizing, to limit without scapegoating, to welcome without lying. The far right sees real failures and turns them into racial myth. The liberal establishment sees real hatred and uses it to avoid responsibility for failure. The police see disorder and often miss justice. The migrant sees safety and may find suspicion. The citizen sees compassion extended to others and wonders why no one had compassion for him. The empire is gone, but its language remains, swollen and unserious. Britain still wants to speak as if it can absorb the world's pain, but it cannot even honestly narrate its own. It wants the prestige of mercy, without the discipline of order. It wants the moral glow of asylum without the administrative burden of protection. It wants diversity without trust, policing without sight, sovereignty without competence, remorse without limits. And so the country produces scenes that should shame every faction. A boy on the pavement, a woman behind the door, a Jewish house in Alexandria. 3 scenes separated by centuries and joined by one question. Who is protected when the state can no longer tell the truth? In the first scene, the truth is physical. A boy is bleeding. The state does not see him quickly enough. In the second, the truth is moral. A woman is innocent. The mob does not care. In the third, the truth is historical. A minority has become the vessel for a city's unresolved contradictions. The empire above it lets the street below it answer with violence. No nation is innocent once it begins outsourcing its failures onto bodies. Britain should stop lying about what it can absorb. The mob should stop pretending that arson is justice. The police should stop mistaking procedure for moral sight. Migrants should be warned that the old imperial sanctuary is no longer guaranteed sanctuary. Citizens should be told that rage will not resurrect their country. Religious communities should be protected from collective blame, but religious exemptions around weapons should end. The stranger should not be made to carry the sins of the state. The victim should not be used to justify a new victim. There is no purity available here, only judgment. The tragedy is not that no one has a grievance. The tragedy is that everyone does. The dead boy has a grievance against the man with the dagger and the state that failed him. The woman behind the door has a grievance against the men outside and the country that could not protect her. The citizen has a grievance against rulers who imported moral complexity while refusing material responsibility. The migrant has a grievance against the fantasy that brought him into a country prepared to use his labor and resent his presence. The Jew of Alexandria has a grievance against every civilization that decides the minority is the easiest place to store its fear. And God, if He is still listening beneath the sirens and the chants and the breaking glass, has a grievance against all of us for how quickly we turn suffering into permission. Once, empire arranged the world and called the arrangement peace. Now the empire cannot arrange a street, a trial, a border, a house, or a human face into justice. The dagger remains. The door remains. Between them stands the failed state, holding its forms, reciting its values, asking the bleeding and the terrified to wait while it decides what can be seen. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.